So in Afghanistan, we're seeing yet another pretty horrific development. The Taliban have banned women from attending universities and colleges. What sparked this decision?
Well, I would say that it is an incredibly distressing decision, but in some ways not shocking nor a surprise. We have to understand that the suppression of women is really integral to the extremist ideology of the Taliban. And those of us who are familiar with the way they ran Afghanistan in the early dark days of their first rule of that country, we're not shocked. We're not surprised by this tragic development. And so, I think in some ways it was inevitable because for the Taliban, they really cannot move into a modern pluralistic society in which women are full participants and have their full place at the table. And so it seemed like sooner or later they would get around to taking this really outrageous and dreadful step.
It's interesting. It seems like women aren't even partial participants in society. I mean, looking at some of the other things they've done, and I'd love for you to detail some of them, but not allowing women to go to gyms, not allowing women to get lower education under college as well. What are some of the other ways they have restricted women's rights over the last couple of months, even the last year?
Yeah, well, once again, women are required to be completely veiled if they step outside the confines of their home. They're really not permitted to go anywhere without a male escort, a family member male escort. Uh, they are now excluded from education past the sixth grade. So the Taliban, in a sort of weird process, had kicked young women, young girls out of high school, but there still seemed to be this odd opportunity for them to go to the university. And so they could go through sixth grade. They couldn't go past sixth grade, but then somehow they could go to the university, which is one reason why I think many of us who have followed the situation there felt that this was very, very likely. But in a broader sense, the Taliban do not view women as equal members of the human race. They are subjugated and repressed and suppressed and really robbed of their most fundamental human rights. And, earlier this year, the Lantos Foundation, which I serve as president of, had the opportunity to honor three extraordinary Afghan women with our highest human rights award, the Lantos Prize. One was a distinguished judge, one was a tech CEO and entrepreneur, and one was the founder of the first Afghan women's soccer team. Judge Fauzi Amina, the judge, Roya Mahbub, this remarkable high tech entrepreneur, and Khalida Popal, this fabulous athlete and inspirational figure. And I have to say that anyone who has spent time with the women of Afghanistan, you cannot help but be so impressed and humbled by their strength, by their courage, by their bravery, their determination. They are extraordinary women. And so this really feels like such a tragic, tragic development to those of us who care about that country and especially about the women and girls of Afghanistan.
Well, and I want to talk about what sparked this. Obviously, the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan. I want to get into that in a moment. But one of the things that's been so interesting to watch since the Taliban came back to power are these open pledges about being more pluralistic and respecting women. That they're going to not be extreme. That they're saying all these things, and none of the actions are lining up with those things. What do you make of that attempt to look a certain way, but yet doing the exact opposite?
Well, of course, it's the very definition of hypocrisy. I think the reasons behind it are fairly obvious. Afghanistan is an economic basket case, a disaster, a humanitarian disaster. And so the cynical sort of mouthpieces, if you will, of the Taliban naively believe that if they just mouth certain sentiments and make certain utterly meaningless and untrue pledges, that somehow that will free up international aid. But I think we need to recognize that a leopard does not change its spots. And this regime and these leaders are the same brutal, violent, extremist, repressive dictators that ruled Afghanistan more than 20 years ago. They have not changed. And we shouldn't be fooled and we shouldn't be duped. I don't believe they can, consistent with their ideology, which is their raison d'etre, I don't think they can evolve to become a respectable governing authority welcomed among sort of the respectable nations of the world. I don't believe that's possible. I think they are so committed to this medieval ideology. It's really not religion, it's an ideology that they could not remain the Taliban and evolve in a way that would make them an acceptable partner for the rest of the world.
Well, and we've seen horrific stories coming out about Christians living in Afghanistan and how scary and traumatic and potentially deadly it is for those groups again as well. And I think, there's so much debate and discussion about, you can have the debate all day long about whether the United States should have been there or not. And that's not really what we're here to do. I think for me, talking about the decision for the US to remove troops and leave the country the way that we did in 2021, I would love to get your perspective on that decision and the impact that it's had on the Taliban and them being able to come back into power in this way.
Well, we're talking today about the women of Afghanistan, and clearly that decision was a tragedy for them, an unalloyed tragedy. They had made enormous strides, even with all of the challenges, all the violence, all the warfare. The women of Afghanistan had made extraordinary strides. I think in retrospect, we can see that, as you say, whether or not one agreed with the underlying decision that it was time for the United States to end its involvement in Afghanistan, the way in which it happened was deeply problematic. And, historians will, for many, many years, even decades, be debating whether it was necessary that every single element of US presence be entirely withdrawn from that country. By the time those decisions were made, there was really very little risk and danger to the small number of American servicemen who remained in the country, but they were a stabilizing and training force. And so, it's of course always easy to armchair quarterback, and there are many, many cross-cutting considerations that had been sort of taken in by the administration, but it was a deeply problematic decision. And as I say, certainly for the women and girls of Afghanistan, it was a pure tragedy.
Absolutely. And how would you say, looking at the situation, you mentioned the poverty there. We know what's going on there. I think it was something like 97% of the people were living under the poverty rate, and that was months ago. So basically, everybody is impoverished, living in terrible circumstances. Now, women can't go to school past sixth grade. They can't go to college. They can't work. They can't leave the house without a man. I mean, it's a really terrible situation. How does the international community, in your view, respond to this?
This is the most important question and the most frustrating question, because at the end of the day, the tools at the disposal of the United States and the international community are limited. And they're limited because the rule of a government like the Taliban government puts us in a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we want to use the toughest possible sanctions to squeeze these terrible governments, to make it difficult and hopefully eventually impossible for them to sustain themselves. We want to get rid of these kinds of governments like the Taliban in Afghanistan. On the other hand, too often those sanctions harm the very people who are already victimized by those governments. And for myself, somebody who's been a human rights activist for a long time, we struggle with this dilemma. One thing that I think the Biden administration is trying to do, and I think they're trying to use deftness in their foreign policy in doing this, is to take, I think it's about $7 billion in assets that belong to the Afghan people that were frozen after the Taliban took over, and try to find an alternate mechanism working with governments like Switzerland to get some of those resources into the country without it going through the hands of the Taliban and without the Taliban really being able to access those resources. I think that's sort of one example of an effort to thread a very small needle. Uh, I have had the privilege, really, over the last year of working just in my own local community here in New Hampshire with something called a neighborhood support team. And these are just groups of citizens, well meaning individuals who come together to support Afghan refugee families that have been resettled in our country. The young family that our team works to help and support, is a father, a young mother, and three very young children. The dad has a job working at a local hospital, and earns a decent wage, but they are struggling because every week this family tries to send back between $300 and $400 to their starving family members left in Afghanistan. That gives you a sense of how dire and urgent the needs are. Somebody working in this country on a modest wage, that, in all honesty, would be just barely enough to meet their expenses here in the United States, is still, in some senses, living in the lap of luxury compared with the family members they've left behind. And so you're quite right. Poverty is very widespread. Hunger is very widespread. Most people in Afghanistan are really just holding on by their fingernails. And so, and so we do face a real dilemma. We cannot help and support this government, which is trampling on human rights, religious freedom rights, women's rights on a daily basis, and is tightening the noose around so many of these communities. You mentioned the plight of Christians in Afghanistan. Also, the Hazara community is terribly, terribly mistreated. Um, so we can't do anything to strengthen or support the Afghan government, but we also can't turn our backs on the needs of the suffering Afghan people. It's not a good position to be in. It's between a rock and a hard place.
It is not a good position to be in because you have real people suffering and struggling as a result of a government that most of them probably don't want, right? So it's a very tragic situation. My last question for you, I love what you just mentioned, the group that you're involved in there locally. I think a lot of people might be watching or listening and they're feeling like, goodness, I wish there was something I could do
Yeah.
to be involved in some way to help. I don't know if you have any recommendations there, but if so, would love to hear them.
I actually do have recommendations. So, one recommendation would be, and you can easily find this if you go online, the miracle of the internet, find out about the resettlement agencies, the refugee resettlement agencies in your general geographic area, and get in touch. Say, I'm somebody who would like to be of assistance helping an Afghan or perhaps another refugee family as they attempt to make their way in this country, to find their footing. And in the early months, as families attempt to resettle, it's really about the practical necessities, helping them find housing that they can afford, perhaps connecting them with social services in your community, because there are significant services available, but they need people to help them navigate that. It's pretty daunting, especially if you don't speak the language. But as time goes on, and there may be families in your listeners' areas who are settled, but they're still not integrated. They need to have people who can befriend them, who can include them in the community, or perhaps help them um, get transportation so they can worship with co-religionists. There are a lot of things that you can do, and then I think for Afghan girls and women, contact your local academic institutions. Find out if they are offering some sort of scholarship programs that you might be able to support or contribute to. It really is a very good feeling, especially at this time of year when we try to look beyond ourselves. We try to see, what good can I do that is beyond just my own intimate family group. And then, lastly, I would really urge your listeners to contact their senators and their members of Congress. There is legislation in the Congress that really must be supported, that would provide accelerated humanitarian visas for many, many Afghans who assisted our armed forces, who aided the United States when we needed them, and have been left stranded in Afghanistan. Some of them have been able to get out of Afghanistan, but they're now sort of stranded in neighboring countries and elsewhere. These are a matter of our national honor, and so it's really important that people reach out and put pressure on their congressmen and senators to support legislation that will provide humanitarian parole for those who helped us when we were there in our time of need, and now they are looking to us to fulfill a pledge of honor that we would stand with them.
Well, I so appreciate your time and helping us break down this complex issue. We look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I want to wish a very Merry Christmas and a very Happy Hanukkah to all of your listeners. This is a time of year when we recognize and acknowledge miracles that defy explanation, and so we should each of us try in our own ways to help hasten small and large miracles in the lives of those around us.